On the morning of the 10th of June, 2026, a Somali referee landed at Miami International Airport. He carried an official FIFA accreditation. He carried a contract to officiate at the largest World Cup in the history of the sport. He carried, in his luggage, a flag of his country that he had planned to kiss on the pitch. He never made it to the pitch. Within hours, Omar Artan was sitting in a secondary inspection room. Border officers had pulled him aside. They asked him questions. They asked him more questions. Then they told him he was, in their words, inadmissible. Think about what that means. A FIFA-credentialed match official, vetted by the global governing body of football, selected from a pool of thousands, was turned around at the border of the country hosting the tournament. The Associated Press confirmed it. Al Jazeera confirmed it. CBS News confirmed it. The Bibbig published a long-form piece asking whether FIFA had lost control of its own World Cup. So, what really happened that morning, and why does it matter so much? Let me walk you through the sequence, because the sequence is the story. Omar Artan was the first Somali ever selected to referee a FIFA World Cup match. The first. In a country where football is, for many people, the only thing that holds the days together, this was a national moment, a historic moment. He had spent years training across African leagues. He had been promoted up the CAF ranks. He had passed every fitness test, every video review, every assessment FIFA puts referees through before handing them a final pre-tournament list. He was on that final list. He flew in early. He carried the documents FIFA had told him to carry. And when he reached the front of the immigration line in Miami, an officer looked at his passport, looked at his face, and waved him into a side room. What happened in that room is where the story gets strange. According to reporting from CBS News, an American official later said the referee had been, quote, talking to some very bad people. That phrase came from a former federal prosecutor named Andrew Giuliani speaking publicly about the case. No evidence was attached to that claim. No charge, no name, no specifics. Just a sentence that traveled around social media in less than a day. Now here's where it gets interesting. FIFA had already cleared this man. FIFA had run him through their own vetting. FIFA had paid for his travel. FIFA, in fact, had publicly listed him on the referee roster for the tournament, and FIFA, when asked to comment on what had happened at the Miami airport, said almost nothing. A few statements, a few expressions of regret, no public fight on behalf of their own official. Picture this. You are a global sports body. You spent more than a decade preparing to host the biggest World Cup ever. You sold the world a vision of unity. You sold the world a tournament that, in the words of your own president, would, quote, connect people. And the first time one of your appointed officials is humiliated at the border, you say nothing loud enough to be heard. Compare that to what UEFA and Europe were saying at the same hour. Multiple European federations publicly backed Artan. African football bodies called the rejection a disgrace. Former players, from England to Senegal to the Netherlands, posted statements demanding answers. The Mirror published a story within hours. Reuters ran updates throughout the afternoon, and FIFA, the body whose own staff member had been turned back, was the quietest voice in the room. Now, to be fair, let me give you the strongest version of the other side. The United States government controls who enters the country. Not FIFA. Not Gianni Infantino. Not the local organizing committee. A border officer has wide discretion under American law, and there are categories of inadmissibility that do not require a public explanation. So in one sense, you could argue FIFA is genuinely stuck. They cannot overrule a sovereign border decision. They cannot force a country to admit someone. That is the Steelman argument, and it deserves to be stated honestly. But here's the counter, and it is a single fact. FIFA chose the United States as a co-host knowing American immigration policy. They chose it knowing the travel restrictions. They chose it knowing that referees and players and fans from dozens of nations would need visas, and that visas could be denied at the airport even after issuance. They chose it knowing all of this, and they signed the contract anyway. You do not get to choose a host country and then claim you cannot influence what that host country does to your own personnel. You pick the venue. The venue is part of the deal. Think about what that means for the next 4 weeks. If a top referee can be turned back at the border, what happens to a backup goalkeeper from Iran? What happens to a physio from a North African squad? What happens to a journalist from a country on a watch list? What happens to a fan who saved for 2 years to buy a ticket only to be sent home from Miami International on a Tuesday morning? The American Immigration Council published a piece this week trying to answer those questions. They could not answer most of them. because the answers, in many cases, depend on the mood of an individual officer at an individual desk on an individual day. That is not a tournament. That is a lottery with a soccer ball at the end of it. Now let me come back to Artan, because his story has a second half that almost no one is talking about. When he flew home to Mogadishu, the airport was packed. Thousands of people had gathered to receive him, not as a referee who had been humiliated, but as a national hero. They carried flags. They sang. They lifted him onto shoulders. Al Jazeera filmed the scene and called it a hero's welcome. Think about that contrast. In one country, he was treated as a security threat with no evidence offered. In another country, he was treated as the man who had carried the name of Somalia onto the biggest stage in world football. Same person, same week. Two completely different verdicts. That contrast is the World Cup of 2026 in one image. And if you want to understand why the contrast hits so hard, you have to look at who Artan represents. Somalia has not had a stable national football program for most of the last 3 decades. Civil conflict tore through the country, stadiums were damaged, federations were shuttered, generations of young players grew up without the basic infrastructure that football in most countries takes for granted. The fact that a Somali referee made it to a FIFA World Cup roster at all is one of the quiet success stories of African football this decade. Years of CAF investment, years of personal sacrifice, years of competing in qualifying matches across regional competitions where the budgets are small and the cameras are absent, and then one immigration officer in Miami ends all of it in roughly 40 minutes. Picture the families in Mogadishu who had stayed up to watch him walk onto the pitch. Picture the children in school uniforms who had been told that one of their own would be in the middle of the field at a World Cup match. Picture the coaches in the small leagues who had used his name as proof that the path was real. All of them told the same morning that he had been turned around. That is the human cost of a paragraph buried in a border policy memo. A tournament sold to the world as a celebration of global football has, in its opening days, produced one of the most visible cases of national exclusion the sport has ever recorded. The Athletic has been tracking visa denials. Reuters has been tracking visa denials. Politico has been tracking visa denials. The numbers keep moving, but the pattern does not. People from certain countries are getting in, people from other countries are not. And the line between the two has very little to do with football. Gianni Infantino, asked about all this, used a phrase he has been using for months. He told reporters this would be the most inclusive World Cup in history. The most inclusive. That phrase, in his own voice, has now been repeated on 3 different continents in 3 different press conferences. The most inclusive World Cup in history. Say it once. Say it twice. Then look at the photo of Omar Artan being walked back through the Miami airport with his accreditation still hanging around his neck. The most inclusive World Cup in history. The phrase does not survive contact with the facts. Here is what makes this moment different from past controversies. In Qatar, the criticism was loud, but it was largely about labor conditions and human rights before the tournament. By the time the ball was kicked, the noise had quieted. In Russia, the criticism was loud, but it was largely about geopolitics, and football in the end was played without major incidents at the border. This time, the controversy is not happening before the tournament. It is happening during it. Every day produces a new case. Every day produces a new headline. Every day produces a new question that FIFA does not want to answer. And the most inclusive World Cup in history keeps being mentioned in the same paragraphs as the words denied entry. Let me give you one more fact, because this one ties the whole thing together. When Artan was sent home, FIFA had to replace him. They had to assign another referee to a match that was already on the schedule. That replacement happened quietly. No announcement, no press release, no statement of regret, just a name change on an internal document. That is how the most inclusive World Cup in history handled the exclusion of one of its own officials. A name change on an internal document. There is one more strand of this story that almost no one is reporting. Artan was not alone. Multiple support staff from African and Asian federations have been turned back at American ports of entry in the days surrounding the tournament opening. Some were physios, some were team administrators, some were translators. Their names have not made headlines because they were not the lead match official for the opening week. But their cases are sitting in the inboxes of national federations across 2 continents. Al Jazeera has begun tracking them. Reuters has begun tracking them. The American Immigration Council has begun tracking them. The list is growing, quietly, in the background of every triumphant FIFA press release. Think about what that means for the integrity of the competition. A team that arrives without its full medical staff is a team playing at a disadvantage. A team that arrives without its translator is a team that cannot fully communicate with the match official. A team that arrives without its administrators is a team scrambling for logistics that other teams take for granted. None of this shows up on the scoreboard. All of it shows up in the quality of preparation, the quality of recovery, the quality of the football we all came to watch. So, what does this tell us about the future of the sport? It tells us that when football and politics meet at a border, football loses. It tells us that FIFA, the body that claims to stand above national interests, will stand quietly aside when a national interest pushes back. It tells us that the next time a player or a referee from a, quote, sensitive country lands in a host nation, they will be wondering not whether they will play, but whether they will get past the desk in the secondary inspection room. That is not a small change. That is a structural change in what the World Cup is. And it happened on the morning of the 10th of June, 2026, in a side room at Miami International Airport, to a man who had spent his entire career trying to reach that exact moment. What do you think? Was FIFA right to stay quiet to protect the bigger relationship with the host nation? Or did they fail the very official they had asked to fly across the world to serve their tournament? I read everyone, so leave your view below. If you found this worth your time, a like helps more than you would think. Subscribe if you enjoy thoughtful football coverage. Football at this scale is never just a tournament. It is a moment in time.